I'd like to thank those of you here as well as those online for taking the time to join this evening's lecture and discussion. In the first section of my presentation, I will offer a brief overview of the Book on the Silk Roads project, which ran from 2019 to 2022, and the second phase of that project, Hidden Stories, New Approaches to the Local and Global History of the Book, which will continue through December 2026 with generous funding by the Mellon Foundation. The Hidden Stories Project's principal investigators are Alexandra Gillespie, Sean Meikle, and myself, each of us paired with an early career researcher. Jessica Lockhart, working with Alex Gillespie, Rachel DeCresh, working with Sean Meikle, and Melissa Morton, who works with me. There are also two postdoctoral research associates connected with the project, Dr. Hagos Abra Abai and Dr. Noam Siena, working in the areas of Ethiopia and coastal East Africa and global Judaica, plus a wide range of collaborators attached to the 9 geographical areas covered by the Hidden Stories project. After that brief overview, I will turn to the main focus of my presentation, which centers on one of those 9 areas, namely the Great Lakes and eastern woodlands of North America, with a particular emphasis on our collaborations with Lenape or Delaware community members. While this research field is significant in itself, it also offers methodological insights concerning collaboration, relationality, and the status of the book that inform the Hidden Stories project as a whole. In the second and third sections of this presentation, I will describe our working methods with Lenape communities as seen in 4 case studies. First, a European printed book, bound in a brain-tanned animal skin binding, painted in red, white, and black, and sewn with a distinctive binding stitch. Second, manuscripts and printed books produced by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous members of Christian communities, which are central to present-day Lenape language reclamation and revitalization. Third, deeds and other property documents of value to present-day Lenape historical work in support of land claims. And finally, wampum associated with Munsee-speaking Lenape communities currently held in museum collections in North America and Europe. I'll speak in detail only about the first of these, the book that appears on the lecture poster, and will be very brief with the other 3, though I'm happy to talk more about them in the discussion. Collaborations on these projects with Lenape partners have established a wide range of relationships that have, in turn, enabled work now in progress with Anishinaabe community members on a significant Birch Bark book, which I will describe briefly at the end of my presentation. I'll conclude by making some comments on our research methodologies, especially as these are related to current work on the provenance of Lenape items in museum collections. The Book on the Silk Roads, now in its second phase as Hidden Stories, began in 2019 as a large-scale project that aimed to tell the story of the book in a different way. Our core research team wanted to counter the standard narrative that runs from the early Christian Codex to Gutenberg's Bible to the digital age. We therefore began to assemble a network of collaborators working on the history of the book within a wide range of cultural environments: Islamic manuscripts from North Africa, Kashmiri manuscripts from South Asia, Chinese print materials from Dunhuang, and many more. Working with digital librarians, we prioritize data management capacity, interoperability, lightweight tool development, and user experience. Finally, we worked with engineers and computer scientists to develop non-invasive techniques for the study of the book, including micro-CT scanning and proteomic analysis. We focused particularly on bookbindings for 3 reasons. First of all, material culture. The materials that make up the binding, the leather, paper, cloth, thread, metal ornament, tell us something about the networks of trade and exchange that are made tangible in the book we hold in our hands today. Second, craft practice. The form of the book, the way the leather was cut and shaped, the warp and weft of the textile lining the end pages, the stitches that hold the pages together. All of these tell the story of the people who made the book. Their craft practices, their manual knowledge, all come to life through the study of the book as object. Third, surprises. Bindings sometimes reveal unexpected things: reused parchment or other materials within the bindings, textiles used as part of the hidden interior of the binding, metal objects such as pins, insects, and other organic material from past centuries. We used to discover these hidden surprises only when a binding had been accidentally broken or deteriorated over time. Now, however, we can look inside virtually to see what has been concealed for centuries. We had been tentatively planning to propose an exhibition at the Aga Khan Museum on global book cultures, and when the first pandemic lockdowns occurred 4 years ago in 2020, we suddenly got the opportunity. International loans were canceled for the foreseeable future, so museum directors were looking for creative solutions. We proposed an exhibition that would be at once global and local. global in terms of the scope of the items on display, but local in that all of the items came from collections in southern Ontario. Speaking for myself, I expected the exhibition to be a chance for us to share our working methods, juxtaposing manuscripts from different parts of the world to illuminate the interconnections of the pre modern world following land and sea routes of trade and exchange. The exhibition also taught us a great deal, however, including some unexpected lessons. Here at right, you see two manuscripts, a Christian text in Ge'ez language and an Arabic Quran, along with a healing scroll also written in Ge'ez. These items were not placed together as a cluster of items from Ethiopia and coastal East Africa, but rather they were situated at different points in the exhibition so that each one was, so to speak, in dialogue with items from other traditions. The Harari Quran, at right, was paired with a closely related South Asian manuscript, the Gwalior Quran, while the Ge'ez Codex in its textile carrying case was displayed along with other items that show how the book might be carried on the body, whether in the form of a tiny carrying case made of precious metal or painted on a luxurious textile that could be worn as clothing. And here at left, you see the early 14th century Toledo Bible, whose artful, abstract calligraphic patterns made a wonderful counterpart to this early 18th century Quran miscellany from China. From the outset, we knew that place and movement through space would be fundamental to the exhibition. That is, the movement of visitors' bodies through the exhibition would be a way for us to bring out the movement of books, people, and ideas along the Silk Roads. We considered having map lines drawn on the floor of the gallery, arranging the display objects in a way that would mimic itineraries and trade routes. But in the end, we decided to simply have a monumental wall map, along with other large scale images that would amplify the image on the manuscript page as you see it right. At left, you can see the Matterport virtual walkthrough generated by the Aga Khan Museum, which continues to be available on the digital companion to the exhibition. The monumental map seen here was unconventional in that we limited the text on it to a timeline appearing beneath the map. The map itself told the story in terms of images rather than words. The items seen here, such as a page of calligraphy from a Chinese Quran, a textile book cover from Kashmir, a healing scroll from Ethiopia, or a ketubah from Greece, appear inside a series of small circles, each edged in a different color that is keyed to a different thematic section of the exhibition. Visitors could search for the item appearing on the map, using the clue of the color to locate the thematic area. This created another kind of movement or flow through the Hidden Stories show. While we were delighted with how the exhibition was received, we were even happier with how much we learned from the process. In particular, we began to develop new research methods as a result of the exhibition and related programming. We marked the closing of the exhibition at the end of February 2022 with an online symposium that placed a book or a small set of books, each from a different geographical region, at the center of a panel discussion. We began to recognize that by placing the book at the center of a community of researchers gathered around it, we could begin to tell a more interesting and richer story. While we were developing this working method in the course of the Hidden Stories exhibition, we also tried it out in another setting, an online workshop on textiles and manuscripts, which took place in June 2021. Again, we gathered experts with a range of research specializations around each book or set of books from a specific region and its codicological traditions. Workshop sessions focused on the use of textiles in Armenian, Chinese, Ethiopian, Islamic, Kashmiri, and Syriac manuscripts. The online page includes a series of resource videos recorded by these groups of experts, one on each region and tradition, as well as videos from the online workshop. A collection of articles emerged from the workshop with some added regions and traditions, which will appear from De Gruyter in 2025. We learned so much during this first phase of our project, The Book and the Silk Roads, especially in terms of methodology. The Hidden Stories exhibition at the Aga Khan Museum, in particular, along with the Textiles and Manuscripts workshop, taught us that we could assemble groups of experts in a kind of virtual circle around a book or small collection of books, and then carry out a cross-cutting workshop that will allow us to reach comparative conclusions and gain new insights into the history of the book. Accordingly, as we moved into phase 2 of the project, we hosted a workshop on birch bark as a writing substrate, which was methodologically similar to what we had done in the Textiles and Manuscripts workshop, choosing a single writing substrate, birch bark, or a single feature of bookbindings, textiles, as the ground for a comparative study across geographical areas and bookmaking traditions. We titled the second phase of the project Hidden Stories New Approaches to the Local and Global History of the Book, inspired by the title of the Aga Khan Museum exhibition. We had learned that we were not so much ourselves telling the story of the book as we were trying to create the conditions for the book to, so to speak, tell its own hidden story. We came increasingly to see the book as itself a relative or relation, following the guidance of Cree and Métis archivist Jessie Lawyer, and to place it at the center of our inquiry not as the passive object of examination, but as itself animate and connected to its community, not just the people who originally made and used it, but those who continue to be in relation with the book until the present day. In moving into the second phase of this project, we widened our scope a bit to include a total of 9 geographical areas, including the Americas, adding Mesoamerica and Mexico, and Great Lakes and Eastern Woodlands of North America. Some of these areas are extremely well established within our project, having been an area of focus since the beginning. Ethiopia and coastal East Africa is a good example of this. Others are newer, including Global Judaica, a subject area that is overseen by Dr. Noam Sienna. While there are 9 geographical areas of focus in the Hidden Stories project, the Great Lakes and Eastern Woodlands area has been important to us in a more foundational way with regard to our own institutional situatedness. The Hidden Stories project is based at the University of Toronto in Canada, with a secondary administrative home in the US, in Princeton, New Jersey, at the Institute for Advanced Study. Accordingly, the land that these institutions inhabit, in which our core team members live and work on, come with a set of relationships and responsibilities. The grounding in the local that is fundamental to the project, therefore, does not pertain only to its particular geographical regions of study. It pertains also to the land that our institutions are based on, and this fact guides our working methods. Working with Indigenous communities of origin has proven to be different in some ways from working with other communities of origin. We have, for example, been able to collaborate with colleagues here in Hamburg to contribute to the support of local conservators in Kairouan, Tunisia, in providing training and materials that enable them to stabilize historical bookbindings in situ. In other cases, as seen here at left, collaboration with communities of origin centers on those in the global diaspora. Here we see a graduate student at the University of Toronto from the diasporic Tibetan community studying a Tibetan Buddhist manuscript. Working with communities of origin in the Great Lakes and Eastern Woodlands area, however, has been quite different. First of all, as I noted above, there are obligations and responsibilities that fall to us working at the University of Toronto and IAS, arising from the land we live and work on. Beyond this, it is crucial to note that our involvement with Indigenous communities of origin was not motivated by the Hidden Stories project area, but converged with existing work. I had been working with Lenape communities on language reclamation and historical work for a few years before we ventured in the second project phase to connect the two initiatives. In short, it was essential to have a substantial, long-term relationship with the community in order to establish a level of reciprocity and mutual trust where shared work on book history could even begin. In a few moments, I'll turn to some of the specific projects we're now engaged on, which prioritize community intentions and goals while also allowing for meaningful and rich study of the book in partnership with Lenape communities. A third project area that has been substantially affected by our collaborations with Indigenous communities of origin concerns book science, which I'll mention today only very briefly. You might think that in a project such as this, we might have scientists and engineers way over here and community engagement way over here. In other words, keeping the different ways of interacting with the book in separate rooms, so to speak. This is exactly what we are not doing. Our working method places the book at the center of study with all of those who bring their specialized knowledge to the book gathered, literally or figuratively, around it. Analysis of pigments, inks, writing substrates, textiles, organic materials, and so on are carried out only when and if we have established a relationship with the community of origin, although the nature of that relationship formation looks different depending upon which geographic area we're talking about. This focus on community-led decision-making also extends to digitizing, cataloging, and access to library materials. And in collaboration with Princeton University Library, we've done some good work in this area in partnership with Lenape community members. A co-written article on this topic by Ian McCallum of Munsee Delaware Nation and Anu Vedantam from Princeton University Library, along with Melissa Morton and myself, will appear later this year in a special issue of the journal Library Trends on Indigenous librarianship. This work may seem far from our project focus on global book history, but maximizing access to material and data in archives and libraries for communities of origin, with a focus on their specific priorities, is a fundamental ethical commitment of our research. Their priorities are our priorities. Having learned this from our work with Lenape and more recently Anishinaabe communities, we can apply the same ethical principle to working with all communities of origin, while also respecting their differences. In this section of the presentation, I will turn to specific book studies that are being carried out in collaboration with Lenape community members. These include the book bound with a painted animal skin seen on the lecture poster, and printed volumes and manuscripts produced during the 18th century in the languages spoken by Lenape people, Munsee and Wanami languages. I'll spend more time on the first volume and will talk only briefly about the others. Before doing so, however, I need to give a brief overview of Lenape communities to provide a context for the analysis that follows. And I apologize for the text heavy slide and to those of you who are already familiar with these relationships. As you know, the indigenous people of North America are sometimes described in general terms. The old, now largely inappropriate term is Indian, although it actually continues to be used in the U.S. in legal contexts and by many tribal nations precisely because it is the term in law. Present day general terms include American Indian in the US and First Nation in Canada. More accurate and preferred usage, though, is to name the specific tribal nation wherever possible. In the case of Lenape communities, this is complicated because while Lenape or Delaware people come from one contiguous territory, which you can see here on the map, which includes all of the state of New Jersey, southern New York State, including Manhattan, eastern Pennsylvania, and the northern part of the state of Delaware, the majority of Lenape people live in what is sometimes called a diaspora, with widely dispersed Lenape tribal nations currently located in Ontario, Canada, as well as in Wisconsin and Oklahoma in the US. Complicating things further is the fact that some of these are federally recognized in either Canada or the US, while others are only recognized at the state level by New Jersey. New York and Pennsylvania do not offer state recognition at all. Additional Lenape communities that lack state or federal recognition, but are nonetheless well documented, exist in Kansas as well as in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. The name Delaware is an exonym or a term conferred upon Lenape people, which is what they call themselves, by British colonial governments. The Delaware River, which marks the border between New Jersey and Pennsylvania, is named after the first British governor of the Virginia colony, Thomas West, 3rd Baron Delaware. As a result, colonial administrators referred to Delaware Indians or the indigenous people living along the Delaware River. Lenape people also lived along the lower Hudson River, which marks the border between New York and New Jersey. The language spoken in this region is referred to as Lenape, which can be spelled differently depending on whether you're using Munsee language, which was spoken in the northern part of the territory, including the Hudson River Valley and the northern Delaware River region, or Wanami language, which was spoken in the southern part of the territory, including the lower Delaware River Valley and the Atlantic Ocean coast. To make things more complicated, there's also a third related language, Northern Wanami, which confusingly enough is actually closer to Munsee than Wanami. Missionary materials include a lot of Northern Wanami, so it is particularly useful for language reclamation work. Munsee and Wanami are two closely related languages rather than dialects. These in turn are closely related to both Mohican and Nanticoke, and Munsee in particular has been used to aid in the revival of these sleeping languages. I've outlined this complex set of relationships because it's a necessary context for understanding the collaborations that we're engaged in. There are multiple Lenape communities, and each stands in a relationship to the others. Each of them has undergone a process of what is sometimes called the Lenape diaspora. And here you can see just one example, an outline of the forced removal of the Stockbridge Munsee Band of Mohican Indians. I won't go through their details of removal, but similar trajectories took Lenape communities to Kansas and then Oklahoma, as well as into Ontario by way of Ohio and northern New York State. In some cases, it is a relatively clear-cut process to establish collaborations with an indigenous nation. If there's one unified tribal government or First Nation, you simply go to the historic preservation officer who's been appointed by their chief and council and establish a formal agreement. In other cases, it's much more complicated. Our collaborations are grounded in a long-standing set of relationships centered on the work of traditional language keepers and teachers of Munsee language, which is a community priority. It would take a long time to describe in detail the Lenape collaborations that have been going on at Princeton over the last several years, so today I will just say that they are ongoing and they are increasingly robust. This coming October will feature our 4th annual Munsee Language and History Symposium, and the gathering will include for the first time a Wanami language keeper as well as Munsee in a gradual widening of the circle of Lenape community participants, keeping language reclamation at the center of the activity. At left, you can see the poster for our third symposium, which took place last November, and the photo shows participants at the second symposium in October of 2022. A key collaborator in these events from the very beginning has been Princeton University Library, and community members have spent a lot of time with books related to Lenape language and history in special collections. Finally, we even hosted a Lenape language camp last summer and hope to do a second one in the summer of 2025 if we can get the necessary funding. You might wonder, how does all this community engagement work contribute to our research project? There's a lot to be said about this, but for our purposes today, I will just say that the integration of community partners in our research is only possible with a long-term, sustainable effort to build and maintain relationships. The work has to be community-centered, focused on the community's own priorities. For Muncie, Delaware communities, Indigenous language reclamation and revitalization is a top priority. Therefore, it is also a top priority in our project. Supporting language work contributes both directly to the project, with collaborative research on early lexicons created by missionaries embedded in Lenape communities, and indirectly in building up a mutual relationship that can grow over time. In the first phase of our work, which generated this digital companion to the Hidden Stories exhibition, our map and our research scope included Eurasia plus North and East Africa. Over the last year or so, however, we've gotten into a position where we can widen that scope, including books such as this one, a book bound in brain-tanned animal skin made by Lenape community members who live not far from what is now Princeton, New Jersey. It is a Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon printed in the 17th century that was owned by the 18th century Presbyterian minister David Brainard, who spent the latter part of his life embedded in the Lenape towns of Cranberry and Crosswicks, located east and south of Princeton, respectively. The book came into Princeton's library through Jonathan Edwards, a Presbyterian minister and theologian who was a close associate of David Brainard and who became the president of Princeton College in 1758. Edwards wrote a biography of Brainard after his early death, which took place in Edwards' own home, and this account contributes to the relic-like status of the book as a memento of Brainard and his Christian mission to the Indians. Even though we became aware of this book and began to study it some years ago, beginning with the first symposium in 2021, Melissa Morton and I, who are taking the lead in this project area, understood that it was important to approach it in an intentional and patient way. I felt certain that we were right to proceed slowly and carefully when at the 2022 symposium, I saw several Lenape people gathered around the book. They commented on the covering, wondering what it was made of, what the significance of the black, red, and white painted lines might be, and how the covering might be meaningful in relationship to the subject matter of the book. Here we could see members of Lenape communities of origin, Stockbridge, Muncie, and Nanticoke, Glen, and Lenape, as well as Muncie, Delaware Nation, and Elenapawi, Lakawit, or Delaware Nation at Moraviantown, connecting with what, for these communities, is welcomed as a relative. It wasn't until the third Muncie Symposium this past November that we ventured to begin to bring the study of this book into the symposium program, with a talk that Melissa Morton and I delivered together. Approaching slowly and intentionally meant beginning with the book's own relatives, and so I opened our joint presentation with an account of those Lenape students who attended Princeton in the 18th century, and who would have walked across the same lands that we were sitting on then in Princeton's Firestone Library. In other words, we placed the book in the context of its relatives as a necessary opening step in our collaborative study, aiming to help the book to reveal its own hidden story. The Lenape community members gathered around that book on these multiple occasions descend from the people who painted and sewed this precious covering, and as a result, they recognized the person who made it, as well as the book itself, as their relative. Only after making these community connections were we in an ethical position to move forward with that research in a positive way, sharing information and guided by community priorities. This book has long been the focus of attention and even seen as a kind of hagiographical relic of the Presbyterian missionary David Brainard. A newspaper clipping from 1844 that was pasted into the book on the final page of the index refers to it as an old and curious book that, quote, formerly belonged to David Brainard, the well-known missionary to the Indians, and was bound by them for him with a piece of otter skin painted in their peculiar style, and from which they had cut the fur, evidently with knives of stone or shell. It was left by Brainard at the time of his death at the house of the elder President Edwards, and from him has come down through 2 generations to its present owner. It is indeed a rare and curious work, end quote. The book tells one kind of story if it's seen as a hagiographical relic of David Brainard, but it tells a different story if it's seen in terms of its historical and ongoing relationship to Lenape communities. When our community collaborations on this book began in 2021, we discovered that Princeton University Library had already 2 years earlier sent out materials for analysis, including proteomic analysis to determine the source of the animal skin and pigment analysis, that is, X-ray fluorescence, at the request of researcher Dr. Steffi Diebold. While we would not have done such analysis without community consultation, it had already been done. So we shared the results that were shared with us by Princeton University Library with Lenape community members. It was not until 2 years later, in late 2023, that updated data sets made it possible to know with a high degree of probability which specific type of animal skin was used. This may sound like a minor distinction, but each animal is, for Lenape people, a differently situated, other than human relative who inhabits a very different place in Lenape cosmology, especially with regard to creation stories. The pigment analysis indicated that the red was mercury sulfide, or vermilion, and the black was a carbonized bone. This is consistent with what we know of traditional usage on similar painted items on hide, such as clothing or ceremonial items. The white pigment, which you can see clearly in this image at left, does not seem to have been tested. Why was the book wrapped in this painted animal skin overcover? The answer can be clearly seen at right in the broken spine. Like many overly fat single volumes, this copy of Bookstrop's lexicon came apart at a weak point in the binding and therefore needed repair. In other words, this overcover was protective in a practical sense, holding together a volume that had become damaged. But clearly it was more than a practical cover. This brain-tanned hide, which would have been a bright white with vivid painted lines in red, white, and black, also beautifies and perhaps expresses something about the nature of this book as it was understood by those who made the cover and formed a community of Christian Lenape. A longer, more complete account of this book and its relations would center on Moses Tunda Tatami, who, along with his wife, were the first two Lenape people baptized by Brainard in 1745. Tatami was an important and influential figure throughout his life, present at many of the most important treaty agreements as both witness and translator. Tatami was not just Brainard's translator, but also his co-preacher. Brainard himself describes in his letters how Tatami would continue preaching for hours after Brainard had ceased. Tatami spent the last years of his life, and is likely buried, just over the town border from Princeton in what is now West Windsor, New Jersey. His family connections include his son Peter, who died in 1753 while a student at Princeton College, as well as other members of the Lenape communities in the region at Crosswicks and Cranberry, and the reservation that was established in 1759, shortly before Tatami's death in 1760, at Edgepillack, or Indian Mills, which is 40 miles south of Princeton. So the story of this book is also a story of Moses Tunda Tatami and the larger community of Lenape in and around Princeton. The book itself has more to tell us about its relations, especially when we look at the sewing of the overcover. This secondary skin covering was certainly added by a non-professional binder, as Melissa Morton has pointed out. This can be seen by the extra cuts for mitering the material that are visible at the cover hinges, visible in the previous slide, which I'll just go back to at right. And this suggests a lack of experience in making book covers. The sewing, on the other hand, shows an experienced hand. Sewing is traditionally seen in Lenape communities as a task appropriate to women, and it is therefore not surprising that the Munsee verb for to sew is ochwala, the root word of which is ochwa, woman. The 7 points of sewing attachment on the inside front cover and 5 points of sewing attachment on the inside back cover may also be meaningful, based on comparable sewing attachment patterns on other ceremonial items, such as drums. This is a topic that community members may develop further. The hide itself may be repurposed clothing, since similar patterns survive on jackets and coats from eastern woodlands communities. If so, the connections between the person who wore that clothing and the book may be meaningful. Alternatively, it may be the case that this brain-tanned animal skin was made in the same way that hides were prepared and painted for clothing, and was meant from the beginning to serve another purpose. More research needs to be done here. So far, we have put this book in the context of its human and animal relations, but it is also useful to put it in the context of its book relations. Here, the most appropriate point of comparison is a 17th century binding that is currently being studied by Seneca knowledge keeper and museum curator Michael Galvin in collaboration with Dr. Steffi Diebold. This is a copy of the so-called Indian Primer written by John Eliot in collaboration with Wampanoag community members, published in 1669, now held at the Edinburgh University Library. Here you see the front cover at left, back cover in the middle, with the title page at right. Galvin and Diebold shared preliminary findings in an online lecture in October 2020 and are currently at work on placing this item in its relational context. They note the significance of the hide used to make this binding, which proteomic testing identifies as sheep or goat. The impressed patterns of vines and fruit, including the strawberry that you can still make out on the back cover, and the whiteness of the skin, now very damaged and dirty, which would have been similar to the bright white of the overcover of the Bookstrop's Lexicon volume that we saw a little earlier. Galvin and Diebold also note the thin wooden boards attached to the gatherings with a stab stitch. These are made of American beechwood. In other words, this book emerges from a community that was made up of both settler missionaries and indigenous people, Wampanoag people, working together to produce not only a textual instrument of language learning, but also a material item, a book that would reflect its European origins in its book format and stab stitch binding, and its Wampanoag origins in the materials, including beechwood and animal skin, processed with a traditional brain tan technique, and in the decorative forms. In this respect, it can be seen as a relation or a counterpart to the copy of Bookstrop's Lexicon at Princeton, both of these a tool of language learning that is the product of settler, colonial, and indigenous relationships. These two volumes differ significantly, however, with regard to their sewing. And here we might turn to other book relations to better understand the copy of Bookstrop's Lexicon at Princeton. And apologies for the poor quality of the image at right, which is a screenshot of Galvin and Diebold's published video. As you can see, the Indian Primer has an irregularly cut cover that is glued to the beechwood board. At left, we see the copy of Bookstrop's Lexicon, attached at the top and bottom by 5 points, and then carefully sewn with fine stitches at both corners. This technique places it in a small family of overcovers from the 19th century, though it remains unique in its early date, early to mid 18th century, and in being made of animal skin rather than cloth. Here we see a comparative volume, which is also, perhaps not coincidentally, an Indigenous language book. It is not a primer or other linguistic tool prepared by a settler missionary, however. Instead, it is a copy of A Collection of Chippewa and English Hymns for the Use of the Native Indians by the Reverend Peter Jones, published in 1840. Peter Jones, or Kakwakanabe, was the longtime chief of his nation, the Mississaugas of the Credit, a Methodist preacher and missionary, and a prolific author. The book has signatures and inscriptions in it that allow us to track its provenance among members of Anishinaabe communities of southern Ontario, including those who are connected to diasporic Lenape communities in the same region, at Six Nations and at Muncie. By placing this book by Peter Jones in its context among Anishinaabe communities, and placing the copy of Bookstrop's Lexicon in its context among Lenape communities, we may be able to gain a closer understanding of the first generations of those who made and used these items, and to acknowledge their connections to present-day Anishinaabe and Lenape communities. To this end, we're currently at work developing a database of comparator bindings with similar sewn overcovers in the hope of gaining a better understanding of these books and their communities of origin. Peter Jones's translation of hymns is a useful transition in another way as well, because it allows me to mention, at least briefly, our collaborative work on other Lenape books and manuscripts, these emerging from Presbyterian, Moravian, and Methodist encounter. I say encounter rather than missionizing or some other term that might seem to overly emphasize settler colonial influence on Lenape people in order to make clear the agency of Lenape people in this process. Peter Jones was an Anishinaabe or Mississauga leader who was also a Methodist minister. Moses Tundatitami was a Lenape leader who also preached alongside the Presbyterian David Brainard. And there are many other examples from the Moravian context where European settlers and indigenous people worked together on language materials. I don't have time and space today to tell this story, but there's some excellent work currently underway by a doctoral student at Harvard, Anke Wilkening, on Moravian Lenape textual relationships. And she's carrying out this work in collaboration with language keepers from Muncie Delaware Nation and Illinopawi Lakawit. Anke Wilkening's dissertation, by the way, is titled Red Sisters, Womanly Fathers, and Queer Domesticities, Radical Pietism, Kinship, and Intimacy in Lenape and Mohican Homelands. She would make a wonderful project visitor on gender and scribal cultures. In collaboration with community members, I'm beginning work on Muncie translations by Charles Half Moon, a member of Muncie Delaware Nation who, like Peter Jones, produced collections of Methodist hymns in his own language. Again, like the work on Bookstdorf's lexicon, which I've described at length, this work proceeds at a pace that prioritizes community engagement in an intentional and thoughtful, and I would say ethical way. The value of this work is not solely historical. These materials are vital to today's efforts by language keepers and teachers to strengthen the Munsee language and to develop resources for increasing the number of second language speakers. In this third and final section of my presentation, I will give a very brief summary of our work on deeds and other land-related documents before turning to a somewhat more detailed account of what we are describing in our project as a book-adjacent technology, that is, wampum, a record-keeping system that was and is used to record agreements among Indigenous people, and was also used to record agreements between Indigenous people and colonial governments. In the latter case, wampum was used alongside written documents like treaties and deeds to maintain a record of agreements and arrange for their ongoing maintenance and strengthening, in a process that was sometimes referred to as polishing the treaty belt. At the very end of this presentation, I'll offer an overview of our ongoing work with a Birch Bark book that emerges from and is in relation with Anishinaabe communities. At our first Munsee Language and History Symposium, which took place in November 2021, this land transaction document was among the items from Princeton Special Collections shared with Lenape community members. At that time, due to pandemic restrictions, only a small number of people were able to attend in person, with others joining online. As a result, the visit to Special Collections, a highlight of each gathering since then, was only in the company of the late historian Mark Peters and language keeper and PhD candidate Ian McCallum, both from Munsee Delaware Nation. At that visit, Mark Peters, who was also a lawyer, commented on the significance of the deed, both in terms of the information it offers, Indigenous terms for local land features and place names, names of Lenape leaders and their settler counterparts, and in terms of the material deed itself. You can see at right how the signatures of the sachems or traditional chiefs at right are accompanied by marks or symbols. The names as listed at the top of the document are Matapeas, Sawapum, and Sepokne, chief sachems of toponymos. These land transaction documents are most commonly accessed in the form of compilations and ledgers in state or county archives. Original copies survive more rarely and tend to be seen as redundant as long as the content of the copies is relatively accurate. These copies, however, do not ordinarily reproduce the symbolic forms or dodems other than with a simple circle or other geometrical form. Mark Peters pointed out that these symbols are meaningful and can be interpreted in the context of orally communicated knowledge that is transmitted within the community of origin. That initial encounter with the Tinton Falls deed was productive in three ways. First, it helped us to recognize the importance of identifying and, hopefully, persuading the Princeton University Library to purchase original copies of land deeds to Lenape holdings when these come onto the market. This has not yet resulted in any purchases, but I am hopeful that it will. Second, it encouraged us to work with local Lenape community members, along with archivists Faith Charlton and Kelly Bolding, to redescribe the online catalog listings and produce transcriptions of all of the deeds in the Princeton collection in order to make these more readily accessible to community members. We also began a transcription project of other deeds in state and county archives, but this job is too big for us to accomplish alone. I'm hoping that we may be able to develop an AI-assisted script recognition project to facilitate this work, to get the transcribed texts out to the communities who are eager to use them, either in support of land back claims or more generally to aid their efforts to have a seat at the table when land management issues are being discussed in political and legal settings. A third way that this specific deeds transcription has been fruitful is intensely local. The territory outlined in the course of the land transfer document corresponds to a town now called Tinton Falls in Monmouth County, New Jersey. This area is inhabited by the Sandhill Indian community, which is not formally recognized as a tribal nation by the state, but which is nonetheless well documented, with a strong voice in community leaders such as Claire Garland. She has worked with Monmouth County to plan a formal ceremony featuring a copy of this deed and its transcription to recognize the history and ongoing presence of Lenape people on the lands described in this document. But deeds are just one way of recording agreements between parties. As I mentioned a few moments ago, the Hidden Stories Project includes within the geographical area centered on Great Lakes and Eastern Woodlands a sub-project on wampum, which we are describing as a book-adjacent technology used to record and renew treaty and other agreements. Wampum has its own binding structures that can be modeled and visualized in the same way that we do book bindings, and it stores knowledge in a way that can be retrieved by a reader, that is, a person who is knowledgeable in wampum technologies. Like the sewn overcover of Bookstoroff's lexicon that we examined earlier, wampum offers us a way to understand the communication technologies that are adjacent to scribal cultures. If we are serious about including traditions and Indigenous communities whose information management practices are different from those we may be more familiar with, items such as wampum offer a particularly valuable interpretive path. On the screen, you see today's wampum knowledge keepers, reminding us that far from being an inscrutable relic of the past, wampum continues to be an active knowledge bearing technology. A wonderful exhibition of wampum recently took place at Montreal's McCord Stewart Museum after an initial period at Ganondagan, the Seneca Cultural Center, culminating in a wampum conference earlier this spring. The photo of knowledge keeper Darren Bonaparte from Akwesasne First Nation is taken from the conference, and the photo above of Munsee language keeper and teacher Kristen Jacobs shows three generations of her family gathered around wampum. Wampum will be central to this fall's annual gathering at Princeton, the fourth annual Munsee Language and History Symposium, where a belt from Munsee Delaware Nation, now held at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, will anchor a wider ranging discussion of treaty obligations and ongoing relationships. The other image on this screen shows a Lenape or Delaware wampum belt collected in Ontario, currently held at the Ethnological Museum in Berlin. I visited it in July of last year in the company of Lisa King, a researcher who also has Lenape community ties, and in consultation with Ian McCallum, one of our project collaborators from Munsee Delaware Nation, and with the kind assistance of the museum's acting curator at that time, Jens Matuszek, along with David Blankenstein, who was at the Humboldt Forum at that time. With Ian's guidance and in the company of Lisa, Jens, and David, we visited the belt. We learned a lot from the physical appearance of the belt, its weaving structures, the size and alignment of the beads, and the traces of paint still visible on some of them. At last fall's Munsee Symposium, I had the opportunity to share information and photos from that trip, and during my residence here in Hamburg this spring, I've been moving forward with provenance research. With the kind help of colleagues, especially Dr. Lucy Carreau at Cambridge, who shared her expertise and knowledge of the Beasley collection, the provenance is largely established, as you can see here. So just to sort of summarize it briefly, the belt was sold to the Ethnological Museum in Berlin by Arthur Speyer, the collector, in 1969. The belt was sold to Speyer by Ernest Oley, a dealer, sometime between 1962 and 1967. The belt was sold or consigned to Oley from the Beasley collection, most likely between 1941 and 1955. That needs to be narrowed down. And the belt was acquired by Beasley from a sale at the Stevens Auction Rooms in London on the 4th of September 1937, in a sale of the estate of the late Lord Amherst. And the belt was consigned from the Amherst family collection to Stevens sometime between 1927 and 37. So I'm currently working on documenting the provenance of the belt when it entered the estate of the first Lord Amherst, who was the general and commander-in-chief of the forces in the British Army in North America from 1758 to 63. Unlike some of his colonial counterparts, such as Sir William Johnson, General Amherst did not grasp the importance of wampum in diplomatic exchanges, instead regarding it as simply loot. General Amherst is probably best known for having a few years later, in 1763, directed his officers to carry out biological warfare against Lenape and other indigenous people, using blankets and other cloths exposed to smallpox. At least two surviving letters from him refer to this explicitly. The letters excerpted at right from Major William Walters to General Amherst recount the transfer of a large collection of wampum from the treaty room at Fort Niagara, which had been established by Sir William Johnson, to the general in August 1760. This date corresponds to the dating of the belt at the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, based on the bead size and weaving, but much work still remains to be done to document this early period and to connect it to the treaty it records. This work has to take place in the first instance within the community, after which it can be shared in academic settings in an ethical and appropriate way. Provenance, though, as the wampum belt makes its way through the various collections, is very much the business of university researchers and museum curators. It's our responsibility to learn as much as we can about the role of our cultural heritage institutions in the handling of items from indigenous and/or colonized nations. To that end, I've been doing research on the other belts that are now or previously were at the Ethnological Museum in Berlin. One of these is also a Lenape belt with a particularly interesting, very well documented provenance. It is now in St. Petersburg, having been taken as war booty in 1946. Another of the Berlin belts now in St. Petersburg is the very first belt that came to the Ethnological Museum in Berlin in the 1880s. This belt, which is most likely Haudenosaunee, came from a dealer in Hamburg, Hugo Schilling, and as part of doing research on the Berlin group of belts, I've been learning about the wampum items that passed through Schilling's hands. I'd love to describe this work in more detail, but that will have to wait for another time. I just want to make note of the ways that the work on a single wampum belt, in this case the Lenape Delaware belt at Berlin that I began with, opens out into a broader study of the belt in connection with its relations, both human in the form of today's Lenape communities, and more than human in the case of the wampum belts that it has traveled and lived with over time. This methodology is very similar to the approach taken with bookbindings in the case of the animal skin overcover of Bookstrof's lexicon. That is, studying the book in relationship with its relatives, human and other. That work we did with the animal skin covered copy of Bookstrof's lexicon has also helped us to begin work with Anishinaabe communities on their book relative. In other words, having established relationships in the field of book history with Lenape partners, we're now doing something similar with a painted birch bark book that is embellished with quill work, connecting it with its Anishinaabe relatives. And this is the last case study that I'll share today. The Anishinaabe Masanegas, or Little Anishinaabe Book, currently housed in Princeton University's Cotson's Children's Library, is written on birch bark with quill work on the covers. It was painted and written in Anishinaabemowin, or Ojibwe language, Ojibwe-Moin, in 1859 by Solomon James, chief of Shawnaga First Nation, which is located in Georgian Bay, Ontario, for his son. Again, in this case, we prepared the ground with the community long before we began to consider work on this book. In October 2022, we held the first workshop of the Hidden Stories phase of our research project, titled Birch Bark, an International Meeting. This workshop was international in more than one way. It included scholars from India, Pakistan, and Ukraine, and it was also organized through a partnership with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. In other words, at an institutional level, it reflected the nation-to-nation relationship that First Nations have with the Government of Canada. The Birch Bark Workshop was held at the University of Toronto's Mississauga campus along the Mississini, or Credit River, and included not only sessions on scientific analysis and conservation, but also traditional care practices, art and making, and spiritual meanings of birch bark. Attendees shared knowledge pertaining to all three of the geographical areas where birch bark has been used as a writing substrate, focusing especially on South Asia and the Great Lakes region. Participation of those working on birch bark in northern Russia and Scandinavia was limited due to the political conditions in Eastern Europe. When we shared the news that we were planning a birch bark workshop with our colleague at Princeton University Library Special Collections, Gabriel Swift, he let us know about this little Anishinaabe book in their holdings. We began to place the book in its historical context with regard to the production of birch bark books and other birch bark objects for the tourist trade in the Great Lakes region. And last spring, almost exactly a year ago, Melissa Morton delivered a preliminary account of what we had learned so far to community members at Michigan First Nation, located on Manitoulin Island, which hosted the most recent meeting of GRASAC, the Great Lakes Research Alliance for the Study of Aboriginal Arts and Cultures. Through that gathering, she was able to connect with the communities most closely related to the book, above all, Solomon James's own Shawnaga First Nation. Dr. Morton has been taking the project lead on research on this book and has been learning Ojibwe-Moin for the last couple of years, in the same way that I've been learning Lenape language and am leading that area of our collaborations. Since this project is Dr. Morton's responsibility, I will only add that we've been working together to plan a collaboration with Anishinaabe artists that will, we hope, lead to an exhibition of the Anishinaabe Masanegas along with its relatives, both other related books from the 19th century and new book forms and art objects made by descendants from its communities of origin. You'll notice I said communities of origin, and this was purposeful. In one sense, Shawnaga First Nation is the community of origin, the home of Solomon James and his son Lewis James, both of whom led their community as chief. But due to the close relationship of the various Ojibwe bands and the interrelations more generally of Anishinaabe communities in the region, the book has many relatives. If we follow the book's provenance over time, we see it coming into contact with members of other communities, both Indigenous and settler. For example, the book has long traveled with a letter written on September 7th, 1871, that provides a translation for the Ojibwe language text and some commentary. This was written by the Reverend Alan Salt, a Methodist missionary who was at that time located at Parry Sound, Ontario. Alan Salt's mother was Ojibwe, and he was a speaker of Ojibwe. In his letter, Salt mentions that he knows Solomon James well, but has not seen him for some time. Comments on how his daughter, that is Alan Salt's daughter, was able to make some sewing repairs on the book, suggesting that she carried some traditional knowledge of birch bark. And he names the Ojibwe man who was carrying the letter, along with the book, back to the Indian agent who had acquired it. In other words, the letter is part of the provenance of the book, not just in a legal or institutional sense pertaining to ownership, but in a richer sense. It gives us a sense of the book's relations over time. In closing, you'll remember that I promised to draw together some strands concerning gender as a way of acknowledging the guest professorship role of gender in manuscript studies that brought me here. Gender emerged in connection with sewing, both with regard to book bindings, when we saw the copy of Bookstdorf's lexicon bound in animal skin, and also with regard to wampum. I want to emphasize that for Lenape people, as for other indigenous nations of North America, to say that sewing is acknowledged as a thing that women do is not some kind of gender essentialism. It would be better to say that it is a practice associated with the role of women, a role that can be taken on and off as needed by the community and as circumstances dictate. One place to observe this is in the often noted situation that emerged in the 18th century when the Lenape or Delaware began to be called women by their Six Nations or Haudenosaunee counterparts in treaty negotiations, instead of the term grandfathers, which had been the norm. Family relationships, brother, father, grandfather, uncle, nephew, are constantly used to articulate the relationship of one community to another in the context of treaty negotiation. But did this change in how the Lenape were referred to mean that they were being humiliated or denigrated, as Western scholars have tended to assume? It may also refer to the kind of role that was being played by Lenape communities during this complicated period of negotiating and renegotiating relationships among indigenous nations, as well as the British, the French, and ultimately the Americans. Perhaps we too can think about gender as supple and determined by local circumstances. We might think of gender as an epistemological space for us to approach our research differently, to explore methodologies that depart from, or at least challenge, those that were constructed within the disciplinary environments of 19th century nationalisms, colonialism, and patriarchy. Thank you very much.